Stop scrolling. Stop the podcast in your other tab. Stop whatever you were about to type into the group chat, because tonight, at this exact hour, the entire architecture of hip-hop just got rewritten in silence, and almost nobody watching this platform has the language yet to describe what actually happened. Kendrick Lamar has done something to Drake that does not belong to the vocabulary of a diss, does not belong to the vocabulary of a verse, and does not belong to the 50-year rulebook that rap battle has operated under since two DJs first pointed microphones at each other in the Bronx. And the part that should stop your heart for a second. And when this album finally lands and the internet fractures into the people who saw it coming and the people still asking what happened, you are going to want to remember that this channel drew the blueprint before the walls came down. Because what Kendrick Lamar has built here is not a rap moment. It is not a bar. It is not a diss. It is a cage with the door welded shut from the outside, welded by the very man now standing inside it. And I am going to prove that to you brick by brick, layer by layer, until there is no doubt left in the room. Start with the device itself, because the device is the whole story. And the single most important thing you need to hold in your head is this. The ricochet line is not a diss. Sit with that sentence. The edit is so microscopic that a casual listener on the first spin could roll past it without their heart rate changing. But the meaning does not merely shift. It flips. It flips the way a photograph negative flips. It flips the way a coin flips midair and never lands the same face up again. It becomes the exact opposite of the sentiment Drake originally put into the world. And that inversion is where the entire weapon lives. That inversion is the payload. Everything else on the track is delivery mechanism. Because anybody can write something cruel. Anybody can stack threats over a dark beat and call the resulting file a war record. That takes aggression, and aggression is cheap. Aggression has been for sale on the corner of every studio in America for 40 years. But taking a man's own sentence, altering a single hinge inside it, and watching the entire philosophy of that sentence collapse into its opposite, that requires a kind of patience and psychological precision that this art form has produced maybe 3 times in 50 years. The violence is in the restraint. Kendrick Lamar is not overpowering Drake. Kendrick Lamar is outpositioning Drake using Drake's own weight against him. It is the lyrical equivalent of judo. It is the lyrical equivalent of a locksmith turning a key. And that is why the small handful of writers who have studied this line are calling it the single most unanswerable bar of this entire feud. Because it reduces down to one brutal principle. You cannot punch back at your own reflection. You cannot out-rap yourself. You cannot out-quote your own mouth. Walk through it slowly. If Kendrick had come at Drake with a fresh insult, Drake could answer with a fresh insult. That is the exchange. That is the sport. That is what Drake has spent 15 years mastering. But when the ammunition being fired is Drake's own published sentence, every conceivable response Drake could give forces him to publicly argue that his own famous lyric has been misunderstood. And that is not a defense. That is a confession. That is a live admission that the words he wrote and shipped and monetized and stood on stages to sing back to sold-out arenas have been reprogrammed into a better weapon than anything he ever aimed at anybody else. And it gets colder still, because the ricochet line is not only artistically sealed. It is legally sealed. It is copyright sealed. Walk through the courtroom scenario from Drake's side of the table. Say he wants to escalate. Say he wants attorneys, wants to file for defamation, wants to argue reputational damage. The defense practically writes itself. Kendrick Lamar's team stands up, presses play on the record, and the exhibit is Drake's own line, written by Drake, recorded by Drake, distributed by Drake, and streamed 1 billion times under Drake's own name. The case does not survive the first exhibit. You cannot sue a man for quoting you. That is not an attack. That is a citation. That is a footnote with the microphone on. And that is what makes this thing so terrifyingly complete. Kendrick has designed a device that is armored against every countermeasure in the rap playbook. The musical counter fails because you cannot out-rap your own quote. The legal counter fails because repetition of your own copyrighted lyric is not defamation, and Drake's own lawyers would have to sue Drake to make the argument stick. And the public relations counter fails hardest of all, because any statement Drake makes about the line broadcasts the line to the next 10 million people who had not yet heard it. Every exit leads back into the same room. And here is the piece nobody is saying out loud yet. Kendrick did not weld those exits shut. Drake welded them shut himself. Every lyric Drake wrote, every record he shipped, every night he stood under stadium lights and let those sentences harden into his public identity. He was pouring the concrete of the cell he is now standing inside. The prison was self-constructed. The keys were thrown away by the prisoner years before the door existed. Now let me tell you what I can responsibly share about the source material itself, because this is where the detective work becomes the story. Based on cross-reference descriptions from 3 separate people whose proximity to the room where this album is being finished is credible enough that I have been sitting on these details for weeks, I can now narrow down the era, the territory, and the emotional core of the source sentence Kendrick Lamar is reversing on track 4. The source sentence does not come from the recent chapters of Drake's career. It is not from the Iceman period. It is not from the polished, 40-produced summit of Take Care and Nothing Was the Same. It is not from the View's streaming empire. The line Kendrick reached for lives in the window right after Take Care and just before Views. That specific stretch when Drake was single-handedly writing the emotional dictionary of an entire generation of hip-hop listeners, sentence by sentence, quote by quote, until his lines stopped being lyrics and started becoming actual furniture inside people's lives. And that window matters more than anything else in this entire story. So understand why. The sentences Drake wrote in that stretch are not rap lyrics anymore. They're ambient knowledge. They're the words people put underneath birthday photos without thinking about attribution. They are the captions that appear at 2 in the morning after a breakup, typed by people who could not name the album if you paid them $1,000. They are quoted at weddings, in group chats, in break rooms, by people who do not follow hip-hop at all and would fail a basic quiz about the difference between an album and a mixtape. Those sentences live in the cultural water supply. You cannot take them back. You cannot rebrand them. You cannot quietly retire them into the archive. You cannot buy them off the internet. Which is exactly what makes them the most dangerous possible raw material for Drake to have left lying around in public. Because when Kendrick reverses one of those sentences, he is not making a reference for rap nerds with encyclopedic knowledge. He is poisoning a piece of memory that millions of ordinary people carry around inside themselves on autopilot. He is kicking something that felt permanent and familiar and safe, and proving in 4 bars that it was never any of those things. And here is the thematic territory, triangulated from all 3 descriptions. The source line is about loyalty. It is about the bond between Drake and the people around him, his crew, his city, his inner circle, his ride or dies, the men he called his brothers on record for a decade running. It frames Drake as the protector, the provider, the man who stands out in front of his team and absorbs whatever incoming fire arrives at them. And that framing has been load-bearing in Drake's public identity for well over a decade. It runs through his interviews. It runs through his anthems. It runs through the entire mythology he built around himself, brick by brick, verse by verse, magazine cover by magazine cover. Drake is the guy who looks after his people. Drake puts on for the 6. Drake takes care of his own. That story is not a footnote to the Drake brand. That story is the foundation the entire brand was poured on top of. Take that foundation out, and the entire tower he spent 15 years constructing does not stand up. Now picture that sentence flipped. Same rhythm, same cadence, same melodic shape people would recognize in half a second. One word swapped, and suddenly the sentence no longer argues that Drake protects his people. It argues the opposite. It argues, through Drake's own syntax and against the backdrop of years of very public, very documented, very screenshotted behavior, that the loyalty language was always a costume. That the man who built a 15-year career promising to hold his team down has a long, visible, time-stamped history of letting his team fall alone. That the promises were branding, not character. That the anthems were marketing, not autobiography. And the zipper on that costume is being pulled down by Kendrick Lamar one tooth at a time, using nothing but the sentence Drake himself sewed into the fabric with his own hands. That is not a bar. That is an audit. And the audit is written in Drake's handwriting, which is exactly what makes it impossible to laugh off. Kendrick is not making an accusation on this track. Drake's own catalog is making the accusation. Kendrick is just the courtroom projector. The evidence is Drake's own voice played back with a single word rotated 90 degrees. The prosecutor is silent. The defendant is testifying against himself with his own greatest hits. And here is the distinction that separates track 4 from every legendary diss that came before it. In Ether, the power came from Nas. In Hit 'Em Up, the power came from Pac. In Takeover, the power came from Jay. The writer built the weapon. The writer chose the target. The writer swung the blade. The entire tradition of the diss record is built on the attacker's authorship. Track 4 flips that tradition upside down, because on this record the power comes from the target. Drake supplied the ammunition. Drake wrote the sentence. Drake chose the phrasing. Drake shipped the record. Drake promoted the lyric. Drake performed it on tour after tour after tour. Drake built the altar. Kendrick just walked into the temple Drake constructed with his own hands and rotated one single brick inside it. And that is the moment the ceiling started to groan. That is the moment the load transferred. That is the moment the tower stopped being a tower and started being a countdown. Now I want to walk you through why this specific line got selected, because nothing about this choice is accidental. There are 3 layers of calculation stacked underneath the selection, and every layer is colder than the one above it. Layer 1 is instant recognizability. The source sentence is famous enough that the second Kendrick's version hits open air, every listener in the entire audience will recognize the original with 0 annotation, 0 footnote, 0 explainer. No ambiguity, no homework, no lookup. The recognition detonates in the same half-second the bar lands, which means the realization detonates in the same half-second, which means the damage detonates in the same half-second. Millions of people are going to have the identical thought at the identical moment, in every time zone, in every language, in every corner of the streaming grid. That is not a slow leak. That is a synchronized detonation timed across the entire culture, calibrated for maximum public simultaneity. Layer 2 is structural centrality. The source line is not a deep cut. It is not a B-side. It is not an unreleased demo. It is not a leak snippet. It is one of the 2 or 3 sentences the entire Drake public identity rests on. It is load-bearing. It is one of the pillars propping up the ceiling of who Drake has told the world he is for a decade. So when Kendrick rotates that specific sentence, he is not scratching paint off a decorative corner of Drake's persona. He is rotating a foundation pillar 180 degrees. And when a load-bearing pillar flips, everything stacked on top of it starts to groan and lean and crack. That is not damage to a lyric. That is subsidence in the foundation. That is the kind of engineering failure the entire building never recovers from because the fault is not cosmetic, the fault is structural. And layer 3, the layer that should genuinely alarm anyone in Drake's camp watching this unfold in real time, is permanent contamination. The original sentence has been quoted so many times, by Drake himself, by his collaborators, by his fans, by the culture at large, by television shows and commercials and film scores and podcast intros. That Kendrick's reversal is going to attach itself to every future performance of the original from now until the end of Drake's career. Understand what that actually means in practice. Every time Drake performs that song from this point forward, every time a stadium crowd screams the original words back at him, every time the track plays in a club, a car, a commercial, a movie soundtrack, a wedding, a barbershop, a coffee shop, a Spotify playlist, the audience will hear Kendrick's reversed version ghosting underneath it. The edit will play in their heads in the same moment as the original. The 2 versions will run in parallel like a shadow the original sentence can never step out of again. The original cannot be decontaminated. Once the reversal exists in the culture, the original is never clean. That is not damage. Damage heals with time. That is a haunting. And hauntings do not have expiration dates. Hauntings do not go on tour and leave. Hauntings stay. Now let me tell you exactly how this unfolds when track 4 finally surfaces, because there is a predictable sequence to it, and the sequence follows the physics of how lyrical intelligence propagates through the internet in the current era. Watch the timeline. Within the first 6 hours of the album going live, the annotation platforms catch it. Somebody on Genius types the original lyric into the notes. Somebody else in the comments connects the dots. It starts microscopically small. A handful of comments. A couple of forum posts. A whisper in a Discord server. But it is accurate, and accuracy travels faster than hype. Within 12 hours, the identification escapes the annotation sites and becomes the mainstream conversation. Hip-hop Twitter detonates. Reddit threads stack tens of thousands of comments. The reactors scramble for their cameras. And the framing of the entire conversation pivots overnight from "what did Kendrick say" to "do you fully understand what Kendrick just did?" Because the mechanism becomes the headline. The one-word rotation becomes the headline. The fact that the weapon was built out of Drake's own mouth becomes the headline that runs on every music site simultaneously. Within 24 hours, every major hip-hop platform has the story locked in. Complex, Pitchfork, The Source, Rolling Stone, Billboard, XXL, The Podcasters, The Barbershop Philosophers, Charlemagne, all of them. And every single one of them runs the same devastating piece of tape. Drake's original line, then Kendrick's reversal, cut side by side, back to back, in the same 45-second clip. That comparison is the kill shot. Because the moment human beings hear the two versions pressed against each other, the reversal becomes undeniable. The edit is tiny. The impact is total. And that contrast clip becomes the single most shareable artifact of the entire feud. Within 48 hours, the memes lock in permanently. Original sentence on top, reversed sentence on the bottom. The meaning Drake intended alongside the meaning Drake cannot escape. Those images will saturate every algorithm on every platform for weeks, bleeding onto timelines that have nothing to do with rap, becoming the defining visual of this entire war. And every single one of those memes is carrying Drake's own words as the payload. His sentence becomes the ammunition in the meme war against him, fired by total strangers, forever, at zero cost to Kendrick Lamar. And here is the moment the coffin gets sealed. Through that entire 72-hour cycle, Drake cannot move. Drake cannot respond to the ricochet line because every possible response makes the wound larger. Respond, and he has publicly acknowledged the reversal, and acknowledgement is amplification. Release a response track, and every bar he writes gets dissected through the lens of the ricochet. Sit down for a stream to explain what the original lyric really meant, and now he is publicly debating his own catalog while the internet clips him in real time. Stay silent, and the reversal hardens into the accepted reading of his own words. Every single option is a door that leads deeper into the trap. The only survivable move is total, disciplined, monastic silence. And that is the one register Drake has never once, in his entire 15-year career, been able to hold for more than 72 hours. Drake speaking is Drake losing. Drake staying silent is Drake losing slower. Every clock in the corridor is running against him. Look at the contrast between these two men, because that contrast is the entire story compressed into miniature. Kendrick Lamar has spent the past several years weaponizing silence itself. He dropped GNX with no announcement, no rollout, no press cycle, no warning. Just impact. He performed the Super Bowl halftime show in the middle of the biggest feud of his lifetime and did not say a single word about Drake in any interview surrounding it. He walked off stage. He walked out of the building. He said nothing. Kendrick has taken restraint and turned it into artillery. Drake operates on the exact opposite engine. Drake floods. Drake streams. Drake posts. Drake releases. Drake saturates every timeline in every direction at every hour of every day because his entire strategic model is volume and visibility. Drake wins by being everywhere. And the ricochet line drags him onto the one battlefield where being everywhere is a liability and silence is the only armor. It forces Drake to fight inside Kendrick's arena, under Kendrick's rules, with his own published words serving as ammunition on both sides of the exchange. Drake is being asked to play defense in a stadium built by the man attacking him, on a beat borrowed from his own record. And I want to pause here for a moment and address the question some of you are already typing in the comments before you even finish typing it. Why is Drake trapped by this in a way that no previous battle target in the history of the art form has ever been? Because every single escape hatch Drake has used across his entire career depends on Drake controlling the narrative tempo. Think about his history. When pressure arrives, Drake moves first and moves loud. He drops music at midnight. He jumps on a radio freestyle. He posts the subliminal, deletes it an hour later, lets the internet do the amplification for him. That instinct, that hair-trigger reflex to answer everything immediately, has been one of his greatest strengths for 15 consecutive years. It kept him at the center of every conversation. It made him unavoidable. But against this particular device, that very instinct becomes the rope around his own throat. Because the ricochet line does not need Drake to lose a debate. The ricochet line only needs Drake to speak. Every word Drake says about it extends its shelf life by another week. Every denial becomes a headline with his own lyric printed underneath it as evidence. Consider the roster of failed counters one by one, because the completeness of the lockout only becomes visible when you check every single door in the corridor. Door 1, the response record. Dead on arrival, because any response has to be measured against the reversal it is responding to, and the reversal is made of Drake's own platinum-certified, publicly beloved words. Drake would be shadowboxing his own catalog on a beat. Door 2, the legal route. We already walked through that collapse. You cannot sue a man for repeating you. Door 3, the emotional route, the sit-down interview, the vulnerable long-form conversation where Drake reclaims the narrative with charm and self-deprecation. That fails too, because the moment Drake says the sentence that is not what that line originally meant, that clip becomes the meme, and the meme becomes the permanent subtitle of the original song. Door 4, mockery. Laugh it off. Call it a reach. Clown the entire theory on a stream. That is the most dangerous door of all, because mockery requires repeating the comparison out loud, and repeating the comparison teaches it to another million people who had not previously heard it. There is no fifth door. That is the entire corridor. Kendrick did not out-rap Drake here. Kendrick out-architected him. And notice what this does to the rest of Drake's catalog going forward, because the blast radius extends far past this one song. Once the culture learns this mechanism, every loyalty lyric Drake has ever written becomes rereadable overnight. Every line about his team, his city, his day ones, his inner circle, his ride or dies, gets held up to the light of the reversal and audited for cracks. Fans will start auditing the archive for free. Old quotes will resurface on TikTok with new captions. The entire body of Drake's work, 15 years of brand construction, will suddenly carry a shadow annotation layer written by Kendrick Lamar and maintained by millions of volunteers. Drake cannot tear away from that. Drake cannot wait it out because the audit does not expire. The reversal has turned Drake's back catalog from an asset into evidence, and evidence does not have a shelf life. Evidence does not fade with time. Evidence only accumulates. Every stream now feeds the case file instead of the empire. That is the lockout, not the bar itself. The bar is only the delivery vehicle. The lockout is the strategic geometry the bar creates around Drake, a perimeter where every direction he can possibly walk costs him more than the last step. Answering amplifies. Silence cements. Lawyers collapse on the first exhibit. Explaining humiliates. Ignoring confirms. There is no counterpunch because you cannot counterpunch a mirror. There is no exit because the walls are constructed out of Drake's own building material. And that is why the people who have been anywhere near this record use that specific word. Not the best verse. Not the hardest bar. Not the most vicious diss. They use the word lockout. The first bar in the history of this feud that leaves the target with 0 legal moves on the board. 0 musical moves on the board. 0 rhetorical moves on the board. A perimeter with no gate. A courtroom with no defense. A stage with no exit door. And zoom out for a second, because this is bigger than 2 men. This is about the architecture of rap combat itself, and about Kendrick Lamar quietly rewriting that architecture in real time, while nobody in mainstream media has the vocabulary yet to name the rewrite. Every battle in the history of this art form has rested on one shared assumption. Both fighters have equal access to the same weapons, words, beats, delivery, timing, symmetric warfare. The ricochet line breaks that symmetry. The ricochet line converts the opponent's arsenal into the attacker's ammunition. It is the lyrical equivalent of pulling a weapon out of your enemy's own holster and handing it back to him empty. And once that technique gets demonstrated in public, once the culture watches it work in real time, the landscape changes permanently. Because now every rapper alive has to look at their own catalog through a different lens. Every artist alive has to ask which of their most beloved sentences can be rotated. Which lyric they wrote 5 years ago is a loaded weapon somebody else can pick up next week. Kendrick has introduced a new physics into the entire art form. Every writer in the genre now lives inside that new physics whether they know it yet or not. And here is the piece of this I want to leave inside your chest for a minute before we go any further. What Kendrick has done here is not just weaponize one sentence. Kendrick has taught every artist alive that the sentences they wrote at the top of their careers can be repurposed against them at the bottom of anyone else's. That is a doctrinal shift. That is not a moment in a beef. That is a rewriting of the safety instructions for the entire genre. And Drake, the artist who leaned harder than anyone alive on the quotability of his own catalog, on the memeability of his own lines, on the tattooability of his own bars, is the first artist in the crosshairs of the new physics he unknowingly helped make possible. There is a bitter symmetry to that fact that lyric obsessives are going to be pointing at for the next 20 years. The artist most quoted, most tattooed, most captioned, most sung back at, most memed, most saturated into the culture, is the artist most exposed to the ricochet. Because he provided the largest volume of raw ammunition anybody in this generation has ever provided for free. Drake did not just build his empire on quotables. Drake built the largest ammo dump in modern hip-hop, and then he handed the coordinates to the enemy. Let me bring this back to ground level for you. There is a source line. It comes from a specific window inside Drake's catalog, the window that produced sentences so culturally embedded they stopped functioning as lyrics and started functioning as reflexes. It is thematically central to Drake's identity. It is about loyalty, protection, the sacred bond between an artist and the people who ride for him. And it is buried inside track 4 of an album Kendrick Lamar has been quietly engineering for years, an album being described by everyone with proximity to it as his most deliberate, most calculated, most surgically constructed body of work to date. The reversal is planted inside that track like a charge placed against a load-bearing wall, waiting for the exact moment enough ears are present in the room for the collapse to become structural rather than symbolic. Kendrick did not just write a bar. Kendrick set a fuse under an entire wing of Drake's discography and walked away from the building before the first crack showed up on the outside. And here is what nobody in the reaction economy is prepared for. This particular device, this ricochet mechanism, is going to be the first bar in the history of hip-hop that gets studied in university lecture halls before it gets performed in a stadium. Because the mechanism is teachable. The mechanism is transferable. The mechanism is repeatable. And the mechanism is now sitting on the table for every young writer coming up in the genre to pick up, examine, and figure out how to fold into their own arsenals. Kendrick Lamar has not just handed Drake a lockout. Kendrick Lamar has handed the entire genre a new tool, and the tool is going to be used against everybody eventually, because the tool works. The tool is undefended. The tool is quotable. And the tool is now permanent. That is the second, larger detonation buried underneath the first one. Track 4 is a bomb. The technique underneath track 4 is the factory that makes the bomb. Kendrick just published the schematic. So timestamp this video. Screenshot it. Save it somewhere you will actually find it later. Because when the album finally surfaces, and the reversal actually detonates, and the internet fractures into the people who understood what happened and the people still asking what just happened, you are going to want to remember that this channel drew the map before the terrain shifted. You are going to want to remember that the architecture was explained here before the building came down. Kendrick Lamar did not write Drake a diss. Kendrick Lamar built Drake a booby trap out of Drake's own greatest sentence. And the booby trap does not argue with Drake. The booby trap simply shows Drake the exact distance between the man inside the lyrics and the man inside the record of his own behavior, rendered in the exact words Drake used to describe himself. And Drake, more than any artist currently breathing, cannot afford to stand in front of that reflection, because the figure staring back at him is not Kendrick Lamar. The figure staring back at him is Drake holding the pen that wrote the evidence. And there is no response track for that. There is no midnight stream for that. There is no caption for that. There is only the ricochet coming back at the speed of his own voice, and the ricochet does not miss. The mirror does not blink. Now here is the last piece of this I want to put into your hands before I let you go. What we are watching unfold with track 4 of this album is not a chapter in a feud. It is the closing of a chapter in an era of hip-hop that Drake defined. For 15 years, Drake has been the artist whose sentences shaped how a generation talked about love, betrayal, ambition, loyalty, and success. Those sentences were his greatest strength. Those sentences were his empire. Those sentences were the walls of the church millions of people prayed inside every night after work. And Kendrick has now demonstrated, in one surgical stroke, that the empire was always sitting on top of a fault line, and that the fault line is Drake's own signature. The next artist to try to build an empire out of ambient quotability is going to build it very differently after this, because they will have watched what happened here. They will have watched the physics change. They will have watched a career get audited by a single rotated word. And they will build accordingly. They will build with the ricochet in mind. They will build with the reversal in mind. They will build with the understanding that every sentence they release is a hostage the future can take. Kendrick, meanwhile, is still not going to say a word about any of it. That is his signature. That is his weapon. That is his entire operating system, refined into a doctrine over a decade of watching how the other side burns itself out on visibility. Kendrick Lamar is going to release the record, walk off stage, and let the ricochet do the ricocheting. He is going to let Drake's own catalog carry the message. He is going to let the fans, the annotators, the podcasters, the memes, the timelines, the group chats, the wedding DJs, the club selectors, the movie soundtracks, and the commercial placements do all of the amplification work for him, free of charge. Permanently. That is not a victory in a beef. That is a passive income stream of cultural humiliation, engineered so thoroughly that it will continue paying out dividends into a decade Kendrick has not even entered yet. The ricochet does not miss. And the ricochet does not stop ricocheting. Every stream is a reload. Every playlist ad is a fresh magazine. Every performance of the original is a discharge of the reversed one inside the audience's own head. Now I want to hear everything you are sitting on. Is the ricochet real? Does Drake have a single move left on the board that does not make the wound bigger? Which specific line do you believe Kendrick has reversed? Which era do you think it comes from? The take care window, the nothing was the same window, the space between them. And when does this album actually surface? Drop every single theory you are sitting on down in the comments below, because the comment section on this video is going to be a time capsule the internet references later. If you made it all the way to this point in the breakdown, you're the real ones. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and share this with the person in your group chat who still thinks this feud is about who rapped harder over a better beat. And if you want to see how Kendrick already quietly dismantled the entire Iceman era piece by piece before this ricochet trap was even publicly discovered, and why Drake's comeback blueprint may have expired months ago without him or his team ever noticing, click the next video on your screen right now. The blueprint expired. Drake just has not read the memo. And the memo, of course, was written by Kendrick Lamar. In Drake's own handwriting. Signed with Drake's own signature. Delivered by a courier who did not need to say a single word out loud. The mirror does not blink. The ricochet does not miss. And the door is welded shut.